The notary was already uncapping his pen when I looked down and saw the second document. That was the moment, not before. Not when my nephew walked in smelling like airport coffee and hugged me a beat too long. Not when he laid his hands flat on the cafeteria table like a man sitting down to close a deal. The moment was right there in a hospice room in Boise, where my brother was dying 12 inches away when I turned over that first page and found a second one underneath it that nobody had mentioned. And I almost didn't look. I almost just signed. That's the part that stays with me. Not what my nephew tried to do, what I almost let him. My name is Gideon Marsh. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years coordinating freight logistics for a mid-sized shipping company out of Memphis, Tennessee. I retired 3 years ago. My wife Cora passed 18 months before any of this happened. And I want to tell you that up front because it matters. A man who has already lost the one person who knew him completely is not a man at full strength. I was still finding her handwriting on grocery lists, tucked into jacket pockets. I was still waking up at 3 a.m. and reaching for a phone to tell her something before I remembered. I tell you this so you understand the version of me who drove through the night to that hospice. Not a man at his best. A man still learning how to carry what he was carrying. My older brother Darnell had been the North Star of my entire life. 4 years older than me, raised in a house on the east side of Memphis where our father disappeared before I was old enough to remember his face. Darnell was the one who taught me to drive in an empty church parking lot on a Sunday morning. He was the one who showed up to my wedding in a suit he'd borrowed from a coworker and danced with Cora like they'd been friends their whole lives. He was steadier than any man I ever met. So when his wife Rochelle called me on a Thursday evening in November and told me Darnell had been moved to a hospice facility in Boise, that the pancreatic cancer had moved faster than anyone expected, I didn't even finish the conversation before I was looking for my keys. I drove 11 hours. I had 3 shirts, a phone charger, and a bottle of ibuprofen. That was it. The hospice was one of those places that tries very hard to feel like something other than what it is. Pale yellow walls, a basket of artificial flowers at the front desk, the smell of lavender candles doing their level best to cover something they couldn't quite reach. A nurse named Petra, small woman, silver hair pulled back tight, gave me a room number and told me Darnell had been asking for me. Had been saying my name in the night, she said. That hit me somewhere behind my sternum, and I held onto it all the way down the hallway. Darnell was down to maybe 85 pounds. His hands shook when he reached for the plastic cup of ice chips by his bed, and his voice had gone thin. But his eyes were sharp when I walked through the door. The first thing he did was grab my wrist with both of those shaking hands and pull me close and say, "Where's Marcus? Did you see Marcus yet?" Marcus is my nephew, Darnell's only son. 42 years old, living in Spokane, working in commercial finance or something adjacent to it. I told Darnell no, I hadn't seen him yet, that the nurses said he'd be there by morning. Darnell nodded. But he didn't look relieved. He looked like a man who'd been waiting to say something and hadn't figured out how. Across the hall from Darnell's room was a woman I'll call Mrs. Aldine Beaufort. A nurse mentioned her name early on, not much else. Late 70s, maybe 80. Sitting in a wheelchair most days with a quilt across her knees and a crossword puzzle book open in her lap, the kind she worked in pen. She had a daughter who came once on a Sunday with a paper sack of clean nightgowns and was gone in under 20 minutes. Other than that, nobody. I'd see her in the common room when I stretched my legs, always by the window, always alone, always working that puzzle, and I felt the particular sorrow you feel for a person at the end of something who is facing it without witnesses. The first day, I said hello in passing and she nodded. The second day, I brought her a blueberry muffin from the volunteer cart in the family kitchen. And she said thank you in a voice that suggested she meant it but wasn't used to receiving things. That was the whole of it for 2 days. Then came the third night. I had been sitting beside Darnell for hours, holding his hand while he slept, listening to the oxygen concentrator and the creak of the building settling in the November cold. Around midnight, I stepped out to walk the hall, get some air that wasn't quite so heavy. As I passed Mrs. Beaufort's room, I saw her lamp was on low and she was sitting up, awake, watching the doorway. She said, quiet and plain, "Your brother is worried about something. I can hear him through the wall. The nurses come and go and they don't listen. But I'm right here, and I hear." I stopped. I said, "He talks in his sleep sometimes." She said, "He keeps saying the same thing over and over. Something about the will, something about the boy." I stood there a moment. Then I thanked her for keeping him company in her own way, and I went back to my brother's room, and I told myself it was the morphine talking. I told myself she was a sad woman who'd had a hard break with her own family and was reaching for something to do with what time she had left. The fourth night changed everything. It was past 2 a.m. I just stepped out of Darnell's room so the night nurse could change his line. I was bone tired in the way that goes past the body, the kind of tired that makes the hallway lights look wrong, makes the floor feel soft under your feet. I was walking toward the coffee machine at the end of the hall when I saw Mrs. Beaufort's door open and her wheelchair parked right in the frame of it. She was sitting there in the dark, not moving, watching the hall like she'd been waiting. She lifted one finger, slowly. "Come here." I pulled the visitor chair over from beside her bed and sat. She had gray eyes, very pale, very clear. She looked at me a long time, long enough that I started to feel it. Then she said, "Your nephew gets here tomorrow." I said, "Yes, ma'am. I know because your brother told a nurse last night when he was half out of himself. He said the boy was coming. He said he was afraid of what the boy was going to do." She stopped. He said it 3 times. He kept saying he should have changed something. The nurse patted his hand and went on to the next room. She paused again. I did not go on. I felt something cold settle in the base of my spine. I asked her what she meant. She said, "I had a son once. He is the reason I am in here alone." She let that sit between us for a moment. "Whatever your nephew tells you tomorrow, don't believe it. Don't sign a single thing. Don't agree to a single thing. Drive home tonight if you still can." I want to be honest with you right now, because I think honesty is the whole point of this story. I sat across from that woman and I thanked her, and I told her I appreciated her concern. And I walked back to my brother's room and I spent the next 2 hours talking myself out of everything she just said, because Marcus was my nephew. I had held him as a newborn at Memphis Methodist Hospital on a rainy Tuesday morning in 1982. I had taken him fishing on a lake in northern Idaho when he was 8 years old, taught him to bait a hook, watched him reel in a perch and hold it up like he'd conquered something. The idea that that boy, now a grown man, yes, but still that boy was coming to this hospice to do something dishonest, it wouldn't fit inside my head. I kept trying to make it fit and it kept sliding back out. That was my first mistake. Marcus arrived the next morning at 11, walking through the hospice door in a dark charcoal jacket, no tie, hair going salt and pepper at the temples. He saw me in the hallway and he hugged me before he even looked toward his father's room. He smelled like cologne and the particular staleness of a man who'd been on a plane since before dawn. He said, "Uncle Gid, I'm so sorry. I got here as fast as I could." He held the hug just a beat longer than felt natural. I noticed it. I let it go. He sat with Darnell for about 20 minutes, held his hand, spoke quietly, said all the right things. Darnell was awake but barely tracking, his eyes drifting between Marcus and me in the window. At one point, Darnell turned and looked directly at me, and he opened his mouth, and then he closed it without saying anything. Just looked at me. Then he looked away. I have replayed that moment probably 500 times since then. An hour after Marcus arrived, he touched my arm and said, "Uncle, can we step out? Talk about what comes after." We went down to the cafeteria. He bought us both coffee. He sat across from me and laid his hands flat on the table. And I thought I remember thinking this clearly, that he looked like a man who'd practiced this. He said, "Dad's been worried about the lake house. You know, the one up in Coeur d'Alene." I knew it. Darnell had built it with his own hands in the late 70s on a piece of waterfront property he'd bought for nearly nothing. By any reasonable estimate, it was worth north of $600,000 today. Darnell had lived there alone since my sister-in-law Patricia died in 2016. Marcus said, "He wants me to handle the transfer." "Thing is, Uncle, the doctor told me this morning he's probably not making it through the week. Maybe not the next 48 hours. There's paperwork that needs his signature while he's still lucid. Otherwise, it goes to probate, takes 2 years, eats half the value in legal fees." He paused. "You know how that goes." I did know how that went. I had watched a friend of mine lose more than half his mother's estate to attorneys after she passed without her affairs in order. Marcus said, "Dad asked me 3 weeks ago to have a quitclaim drafted just to keep things clean. He wants the cabin signed over to me directly so I can manage his final expenses and make sure what's left goes to the family properly. We just need a notary this afternoon and a witness." He looked at me. "That's where you come in. And this was the thing. I want you to feel this, because it matters." He said it all so calmly, like we were talking about a car registration, like it was a small administrative detail that reasonable adults handle without drama. I said, "What about your sister?" Marcus has a sister. "My niece Delia lives in Portland, teaches nursing at a community college, has 2 daughters. She and Marcus have never been close, and I hadn't seen her in years." He said, Delia's not in the will for the cabin. That was set up a long time ago between mom and dad. The property was always meant to come to me. Delia gets the life insurance and the savings. It's all been worked out. This is just paperwork. I said, I'd like to see what your father had drawn up. And right there, just for a half second, his face did something. The smile stayed, but something behind his eyes went very still, like a door closing quietly in an empty house. Then he said, "Of course, Uncle. Whatever makes you comfortable." I went back upstairs. Darnell was sleeping. I sat beside him for a long time, and I thought about Mrs. Beaufort in her dark doorway, and I thought about that half second in Marcus's eyes, and I thought about my brother's hands shaking around that cup of ice chips, and I thought about how Darnell had opened his mouth in the room and then closed it again without speaking. Something had been trying to get through to me for 4 days. I had been very politely declining to receive it. Around 4 that afternoon, a man in a brown suit appeared in the hallway asking for Marcus Marsh. The notary, he had a leather briefcase and the practiced calm of someone who does this kind of thing in hospitals and hospice rooms regularly. Marcus came out of the room, shook the man's hand warmly, and they walked toward Darnell's door together. I stood up. "I'm coming in too," Marcus said. "Of course, Uncle. We just need your signature as the witness." The notary had a stack of documents on the folding tray table over Darnell's bed. Darnell was awake, eyes glassy, shifting between us and the ceiling, and the notary was already explaining the paperwork in the brisk, neutral voice of a professional running through a routine. I asked if I could see the documents. He handed me the top page. It was the quitclaim deed, exactly as Marcus had described it. Property transferred to Marcus Marsh. That part was real. But beneath it was a second document, and beneath that, a third. The second was a durable power of attorney, making Marcus the sole agent over all of Darnell's financial affairs, effective immediately, with no expiration tied to capacity. The third was a beneficiary reassignment on a life insurance policy, $380,000, through Darnell's old union with Marcus's name typed freshly at the top, and underneath, visible through the thin paper in the afternoon light, Delia's name in what looked like the original carbon. I stood there with those 3 documents in my hands, and the room got very quiet. Not quiet the way quiet usually is. Quiet the way a room gets when everyone in it is pretending nothing just happened. I said, "Marcus, what are these other 2 documents?" He said, "Protective measures. In case Dad's situation changes and we need someone to manage his affairs this week." I said, "Your father is going to pass in a matter of days. The doctor told you that this morning. So why does a dying man need a power of attorney?" He said, "Uncle, please, this isn't the time." I said, "Why is Delia's name replaced on the life insurance?" He said, "Delia agreed to that." I said, "Did she?" His face did the door closing thing again. The notary, God bless, that man was looking back and forth between us the way a person does when they've realized they've walked into something they did not sign up for. I asked the notary to please wait in the hallway for a few minutes. He nodded and left immediately. I closed the door. I turned around and looked at my nephew, and I want to tell you something, the 8-year-old boy at the lake was not in that face. Somebody else was looking out at me from behind my nephew's eyes. Somebody doing arithmetic. I said, "Call your sister. Put her on speaker." He said, "Uncle, you're exhausted. You've been here too long." I said, "Call her." He didn't move. So I took out my phone and I scrolled to a number I hadn't called in 3 years, and I called it myself. Delia picked up on the second ring. I said, "Delia, it's Uncle Gideon. I'm at the hospice with your father and your brother and a notary. Did you agree to be removed as the beneficiary on your father's union life insurance policy?" A pause, long enough that I heard her breathe. Then she said slowly, "Uncle Gideon, what are you talking about?" I said, "Did you agree to it?" She said, "I don't know anything about a life insurance policy." "What policy? What is happening?" Marcus was already moving, already saying, "Del, hey, listen, this is a misunderstanding. The documents are just..." She said, "Marcus, what did you do?" He said, "Delia, just calm down." She said, "Uncle Gideon, please don't sign anything. I'll get a flight tonight, please. Don't sign a thing." I hung up. The room was so quiet I could hear the oxygen concentrator cycling. I could hear Darnell's breathing. I could hear, faintly, the notary's shoes on the linoleum in the hallway. Marcus said, "Uncle, you don't understand the financial situation. Dad owes me money. I've been covering things for years. I deserve." I said, "Get out of this room." He said, "Uncle." I said, "Get out." He stared at me. He picked up his briefcase. He picked up those 3 documents from the bed tray. He walked out of the room without another word, and the door swung shut behind him, and I stood there in the silence of my brother's last hours, and I felt something I can only describe as the specific sorrow of seeing something you loved become something you don't recognize. I sat down on the edge of Darnell's bed. I took his hand. He was looking at me. He was crying without making any sound, just tears moving quietly down into his pillow, his body too worn out for anything louder than that. I said, "It's all right, Darnell." I stopped it. He squeezed my hand once, just once, and he kept looking at me, and I understood in that moment that he had known something was wrong for a long time, had been trying to tell me in the only language he had left, and hadn't been able to get it out. I understood that my brother had called me 11 hours across 3 states, not just because I was family, but because somewhere in whatever was left of his strength, he believed I was the one who might actually see it. Darnell passed away 30 hours later, a Wednesday morning just before sunrise. Delia was there. I was there. Marcus was not. Honestly, and I need to say this out loud, I don't know if I would have looked at those papers if Mrs. Beaufort hadn't stopped me at 2 a.m. in that dark hallway. I want to believe I would have, but I had been so determined to trust Marcus. I had built my faith in him across 40 years of memories, and faith built that long doesn't fall apart because of one moment of practical doubt. What fell it was her voice, a dying woman I barely knew, telling me something that cost her whatever energy she had left. I went back to the hospice the following Saturday. I had a box of pastries from a bakery near Delia's house, and a card I had written by hand. The nurse at the front desk recognized me. Her face fell the moment I said Mrs. Beaufort's name. She had passed on Thursday. Quietly, in her sleep, the nurse asked if I had been close with her. I said no. I'd only really spoken to her once, but she had done something for me I would never be able to repay. The nurse was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did she give you a piece of paper?" She hadn't. But the nurse told me to wait. She came back with an envelope. My name was on the front in handwriting that slanted and trembled slightly. The nurse said Mrs. Beaufort had left it at the front desk on Wednesday morning with instructions. If that man comes back, give it to him. If he doesn't, throw it away. I took the envelope outside and I sat on a wooden bench in the cold November air and I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The handwriting was thin and careful, the handwriting of someone who had learned to be precise because the world did not offer them a lot of room for error. It said, "Mr. Marsh, I don't know whether you listened to me or not. I hope you did. My son's name was Curtis. He took everything I had in the spring of 2011. The house, the savings, the rings my husband gave me on our anniversary, every one of them. I have spent the years since in rooms smaller than this one, in places I never imagined I would end up. The worst part is not the losing. The worst part is that no one warned me. I had a neighbor who watched it happening. She told me afterward that she had suspected something was wrong for more than a year. I asked her why she hadn't said anything. She told me it wasn't her place. That was the day I decided that if I ever again saw something happening to someone who didn't see it yet, I would say something. It would be my place. So I said something to you. Whatever happened, I hope you are safe. Aldine Beaufort. I sat on that bench for a long time. A nurse came out at some point and asked if I was all right. I told her I was. I told her I was just sitting for a while. It wasn't her place. And she said something anyway. A dying woman with nothing left to spent what she had on a stranger in a hallway. That is what saved my brother's last wishes. That is what saved Delia's inheritance. That is what kept me from being the man who signed away his dying brother's estate and spent the rest of his life trying to find somewhere to put that. I drove 11 hours back to Memphis that night, and the whole way down I thought about every time in my life I had seen something happening to someone. I knew something that didn't look right, that was gnawing at me, and I had told myself it wasn't my place. A friend of mine whose grown son had started helping with the finances and then helping with the accounts. A woman at my church whose daughter-in-law was managing everything a little too completely. Things I had noticed and chosen not to notice because the space between noticing and acting felt like a cliff I didn't have the right to jump off. Aldine Beaufort had been standing at the edge of that cliff and she jumped anyway. Marcus tried to call me twice the month after Darnell's funeral. I didn't answer. He sent an email long, articulate, full of phrases like misunderstanding and the family you've broken and what Dad would have wanted. I read it once. I deleted it. I did not reply. Delia and I talk almost every Sunday now. She came to Memphis for Thanksgiving and brought her girls. Her youngest, who is 10, drew me a picture of a river with a fish jumping out of it that's been on my refrigerator since December. About 8 months after the funeral, I got a letter from a woman in Spokane I'd never heard of. Her father, a man in his 80s, had died in the spring, and going through his papers, she'd found a notebook where he'd recorded the names of people who had wronged him financially. Marcus Marsh's name was in it, connected to nearly $50,000 in loans that were never repaid. She had found my number through the obituary Delia and I had written for Darnell. She wanted to know if there was a process for filing a claim. I called her. Her name was Vivienne. She was 66, a widow, and her father, out of shame, had never told anyone while he was alive. I called Delia. Delia called her father's attorney. By the following fall, what we had uncovered was that Marcus had been doing this for years, not just to family, to clients, to his father's oldest friends, to anyone who allowed him near a checkbook or a signature line. He had somewhere north of $250,000 in unsecured debt, 2 pending civil suits in Washington state, and a gambling problem none of us had ever been allowed to see. The lake house scheme had been his final play. If he had gotten that property, he could have leveraged it immediately and bought himself another 6 months ahead of the people chasing him. It was not about the inheritance. It was about survival. And somehow, understanding the desperation at the bottom of it made me feel something I didn't expect. Not forgiveness, not sympathy exactly, just the particular sadness of watching someone you love become someone you didn't recognize, and knowing that the becoming happened slowly, across years, and nobody in the family had ever stopped long enough to ask him a hard question. Marcus went to trial 21 months after Darnell's death, not for what he tried to do in that hospice room that would have been difficult to prove, and Delia and I let it rest, because we had everything that mattered. He went to trial for what he did to Vivienne's father and to 2 other elderly clients in Spokane. He received 5 years. He is still serving them as I tell you this. His son, my great-nephew, a boy named Theo, is 13 years old. He lives with his mother in Bellingham. I send him a birthday card every year and a check at Christmas. His mother sends me a handwritten thank you. I don't expect anything from that boy in return. He's not going to grow up calling me, but I want him to know that somebody in his father's family thought about him, that somebody in his father's family chose deliberately not to disappear. About a year after the trial, Delia and I started something small. We didn't call it a program or give it a name. We just started showing up once a month at a senior center near her in Portland and at a community center near me in Memphis, and we told our story. We told Aldine Beaufort's story with her daughter's permission. And then we sat and we listened. The things people tell you when you sit still and listen. I cannot describe to you how many times I have heard my own story with the name switched out and the city changed. A grandson who needs just one signature. A daughter who knows a financial advisor who can handle everything. A nephew who's been carrying the weight of it all and just needs the family to trust him with the paperwork. Just once. Before the notary leaves, it happens every day in every city. To people who read the fine print, to people who balance their checkbooks every Sunday morning their whole adult lives and never thought of themselves as people who could be fooled. I keep Aldine's letter in the drawer of my nightstand. I take it out sometimes, when it's late and the house is quiet, in the particular way that houses are quiet when you've lost the person who used to fill them. I read it. I think about how easy it would have been for her to turn over in her bed and let me walk past her door. She was dying. She had nothing left to give. She had every reason in the world to let me figure it out myself, or not figure it out, and to spend what remained of her strength on something that was still hers. She didn't. She spent it on me. I want to tell you something. Whoever you are right now, wherever you're listening to this, if there's something in your own family that's been gnawing at you, some arrangement that doesn't quite add up, some rush toward a signature, some explanation that answers every question except the one you actually have, trust that feeling. Look at it. Ask the question that feels too uncomfortable to ask. The cost of asking and being wrong is a little awkward silence. The cost of not asking and being right is somebody's whole life. The people who love you can wait an afternoon. The people who don't love you the way you think they do, they won't want to wait. That's the difference. That's the whole difference, right there. I'm 64 years old. I lost Cora. I lost Darnell. I almost lost my brother's life's work in the last 30 hours of his life because I wanted to believe that the boy I taught to bait a hook at a lake in Idaho was still that boy. He wasn't. And one of the hardest, most honest things I have ever had to do in my life was look at what was actually standing in front of me instead of what I wished was there. Before I let you go, I want to hear from you. Leave me a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Tell me about the person in your life who told you the truth when it wasn't easy to say. Who was your Aldine? And if you're sitting with something right now, something in your own family that doesn't feel right, drop a 1, a 2, or a 3 below. 1, if you think you would have trusted your instincts. 2, if you think you might have signed. 3, if you've been in a room like that one and you already know exactly what it feels like. I read every comment. Everyone. And if this story reached you in some way you didn't expect, I hope you'll subscribe and stay. I'll be back here telling true things as plainly as I can. Don't sign it tonight. Drive home if you can. The truth will still be there in the morning, and so will the people who actually love you. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Memphis, Tennessee to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.